Mace Ward from Auckland Council joins me in this episode. Mace was the General Manager of Group Recovery at the time of Cyclone Gabrielle and a Group Controller in the lead up to the cyclone. Mace talks about his role in the recovery and the learnings and changes that have been put in place by Auckland Council since the cyclone.
I don't think you can ever be absolutely prepared, but you can actually be more prepared than we were at that time, and that's been acknowledged.
He unpacks the categorisation process of houses in Muriwai, valuations, submissions, payouts and settlements for red-stickered homeowners, and the dispute process.
And did we get it perfect? I'm sure people would say no, but certainly trying to understand, put ourselves in the shoes of those people who are impacted. And just that building that trust and openness and honesty about what we could do when we were likely to be able to respond was really critical.
I ask Mace if Auckland Council expects to respond better to future weather events and what's been put in place within the council and the government around emergency management. Mace shares what he thinks Muriwai did really well and a message to our community and advice for other communities going through a similar event.
Kia ora, Mandy. Kia ora mai tātou, ko Mace Ward tako ingoa. I am the General Manager of Group Recovery across Auckland Council, and this was a program that was set up to focus on the recovery from the 2023 North Island weather events of both the anniversary weekend floods and also Cyclone Gabrielle, and then we had a number of other events that followed: a tornado in East Tamaki affecting 125 homes, and floods in May of 2023 as well, and then really responding to central government's proposal around how we respond to those events together with the Hawke's Bay and other regions around the country.
And how did you initially make contact with the Muriwai community?
So my role started from the 29th or 28th of January, from being asked to come in to Auckland Council and meet with the Mayor. But then in Cyclone Gabrielle, I had a role as the controller, or what's known as the group controller, and lead up to Cyclone Gabrielle. We knew, as the region did, that it was likely we would be impacted by that subtropical cyclone that formed in the Coral Sea. We had some pre-warning. What we didn't know, of course, is exactly where, when, and the veracity of what occurred on that night, or the tragedy that might unfold as well. So that was a significant impact. But from 1:30 in the morning, I came back in on the 14th of February into the Emergency Coordination Centre, and then was involved from then on, working particularly with those communities that were most impacted. And Muriwai was obviously a community that was impacted severely with the tragedy of a loss of life of first responders, but also people's homes, the places they should feel safe in being lost, and that tragedy of the loss of property and the loss of where people lived, worked and played, if you like, and a community that was loved by Aucklanders, and with a regional park visited by over 1 million people every year, a place that people had made their homes, a place that people had a deep connection with. So our first reaction with the community was in a really raw meeting of understanding what their needs were, and there was a release, I guess, of that trauma.
So that meeting was about 3 or 4 days after the event.
Yeah.
And Is it right that you asked the community or somebody asked the community to put questions together? That was one thing that upset people, that the group of people from the council weren't quite prepared with the answers to those questions at that early stage.
Yeah, there's two things. I guess we had really quite strong interactions immediately following. So, that morning, when there were people in the Muriwai Surf Club and then having to evacuate, as well as also unaccounted for first responders and emergency response. But yes, that first all community meeting, that uncertainty that exists is quite difficult for a community to grapple with, of not knowing what the future might hold. And that's one of the key learnings is around recoveries and responses. You don't always have the answers. And the community doesn't have those answers either. So having the right conditions for the community to get together and think about what those are in the future, and the council to be open, or people in authority, if you like, to be open and honest about that when you don't know what the future looks like. And that's confronting, and for everyone. And I think in the case of Muriwai, where we had a cordon around Muriwai, we were, because of the risks, and we had ongoing landslip risk for quite a long time, but we also had significant risk of people's homes being evacuated, and security risks, and being respectful about what had occurred in that community.
Do you feel like it was maybe a little bit too early? Or, are there learnings that you've taken away from that you might apply next time if it happens?
Yeah, and without being trite, we are wanting to leave some artifacts from this recovery from 2023 in terms of a playbook, if you like. So what's the toolkit that people can lean into? And we'll be leaving some things in place in terms of capability and capacity in the council and Auckland Emergency Management, but more broadly, that people who can respond. And were we unprepared as a council for this type of event? I don't think if you can ever be absolutely prepared, but you can actually be more prepared than we were at that time, and that's been acknowledged. And have our community more prepared as well. There was quite a bit of work done in 2014 with a community response plan, and risks were known, but that wasn't kept alive, if you like. That wasn't kept warm. So those are the significant sort of learnings of what is the playbook, having the right people. It's not knowing the people in the community who are able to respond to that. But many of those people as well were traumatized. Phelan Perry, who was the local board member, the chief firefighter, he was wearing a lot of hats, and he had suffered a significant shock in terms of people who had lost their lives. And he was there on that night. So what we did see, though, out of that trauma was people in the community emerging as leaders, and people in the council emerging as leaders as well, taking on that leadership role. How do we work our way through this? How do we make sure that we treat people with respect, we're open and honest, we really lean into understanding what occurred here, but what's the future? Because people need certainty. It's pretty difficult if you've lost your North Star, if you like, of your home, and you're having to live with that uncertainty. So difficult. And as a community, what was the future? For Muriwai.
Can you explain your exact role and what you were hoping to achieve, and the team that you built around you?
Yeah, so that initial phase was very much about what's termed response of, how do you make things safe? How do we learn and understand what's occurred? But moving into the recovery phase, that's where we could really focus on the community. So I was asked to set up a team for the recovery phase across Auckland. So we had a number of really highly impacted communities across Auckland. How would we respond recovery. And we developed a number of programs across that team, and one was community and social recovery. So how do we go into the community and understand what their priorities are, how we might respond. The natural built environment is the obvious one. The other key program is what occurred, how do we repair things in terms of roads and infrastructure, but where is it going to be unsafe, and where is it going to be safe to rebuild in a community. And then there was a program around what the economic impacts were, and that was probably light touch. We were doing that with government agencies as well, but really understanding what the economic impacts were. And then Māori participation and partnership where iwi were impacted. So iwi having a role in Muriwai was critical in terms of those impacts as well. But importantly, there was also a relationship into central government. So what is our response? How is central government going to respond? This was a bit of a bellwether for climate adaptation, and a period we were entering of an unstable climate where we were going to see impacts across the region and across the country. And significantly, the Hawke's Bay had also suffered a significant tragedy, as well as Gisborne, Tairāwhiti, parts of the Bay of Plenty, although not as extreme, but certainly Gisborne, Tairāwhiti, and those communities like Wairoa, Hastings, the Esk Valley. How could we work with central government to ensure that there was support coming back into Tamaki Makaurau, but specifically also Muriwai. So my role was very much about, taking a helicopter view, if you like, of looking across the region, but also, but significantly, we knew there were priority communities. So we had some priority communities where we knew we needed to take a more deliberate approach, and having people taking a focus. And Muriwai was one of those communities where, there was a clear need for more support, and the impacts were significant. So understanding that natural environment, what was the current state, what was the likely future state, was important. So an area-based study of the geotechnical risks and hazards was something we really focused on. And Ross Roberts, our chief engineer, we built a team within the recovery office that I led around the geotechnical response to that. And as things emerged very quickly, was what became known as categorisation. But we knew we'd done placarding or stickering, if you like, of over 7,500 properties, significantly. 600, over 600, almost 700 of those were red stickered. That had connotations with, the tragedy of the Christchurch earthquake, of red zones. So the mixing up of or the assumptions rather that are made around red stickering is quite interesting. We definitely had to unpack those.
What were those assumptions?
People had a view if it was red stickered, then it was, it was totally gone. But that's not the assumption. But as it turned out in Muriwai, we did take that approach of looking across Muriwai as an area of where was it unsafe, where was it safe. That took time and careful consideration. We were dealing with people's, one of their most significant assets. We were dealing with a community that was, as I said, there was a lot of trauma within the community. People were displaced from their community, from the people that they lived and worked amongst. Kids were displaced from their homes, so life was disrupted. So it's quite a difficult place to have a conversation with people about. But I think as we built trust and confidence, and people in the community took a leadership role, and the council took a leadership role, and that was significantly part of my role, was to make sure that we were open and honest. We said what we knew. We said what we didn't know. We said what we were doing and when we would know more. And we had some great people who were working out there on site. And we allowed people to go back into their homes and collect important possessions. And that was heavily curated because of the risks that were ongoing.
There has been talk about, especially sort of partway up Mototara Road, of the sort of blanket red sticker approach, just to make it easier, so that then you can kind of take your time to figure out what category the houses actually belonged in, which was, I can sort of understand how that would be for you and also for the homeowners. What do you say to that?
I think there were expectations that we would have a formula that we could roll out and at a house, at a property level, and that just wasn't the case. We just didn't have that detailed knowledge of the geotechnical issues that were on a particular property or even in an area. So that work that the geotech engineers did was quite critical. So we had that area-based approach where we could actually codify down to an individual property or cluster of properties, was quite important. At the same time, working with central government around, well, if this is now unsafe, is that an insurance only issue, or is there a central government support around a retreat option? We were also cognizant that there had been previous landslips in Muriwai where there had been the tragedy of deaths in the mid-1960s. And so not wanting to repeat perhaps the mistakes, or provide the community certainty around the future was really important, and involve them in that process, which is asking a lot of people to go, you've suffered this trauma and these tragedies in your community, you're farewelling people who died on the night of Cyclone Gabrielle, but we also want, we're wanting you to lean into and help us make really critical decisions about not only your own home, but the broader community of what the community looks like in the future, and the removal of over 70 homes from the community, and essentially what's become known as Category 3, or land that is high hazard. And some of that land may be able to be reused as non-residential land, but much of it will continue as high hazard land, and planted and looked after as an area of passive use, if you like.
When you issued the red stickers, were you expecting that over time some of those houses might be recategorized and people could actually come back to those homes? Did you have any sort of idea of how that might play out in the future? People thought they would never get back to their homes, and then they were allowed to come back to their homes, and there were so many different levels within that, wasn't there?
Yes. And like I say, the red stickering is a point in time of a rapid building assessment. So the emphasis is on rapid, I guess. But under that longer term work around the geotech assessment, was the critical part of understanding where the risks were high. And even then, we had the storm in July last year in 2025 demonstrated that there was, we hadn't quite got the boundaries right, or the geotech engineers, even after that quite intense survey work, we needed to extend that area, and another 2 homes were brought into being removed and bought out. Those risks don't go away. The circumstances were not unprecedented, of course, but for for that community. They hadn't faced that before, and either in many ways Auckland Council hadn't faced that on a scale that had occurred across the region, and two significant weather events that had caused quite significant damage. We are now at a point where we've bought out 1,160 homes.
That's homes from across the Auckland region.
Assisting people repair over 150 homes so they can stay in their homes with property level interventions. And we've done some work across the region of identifying hazards in our district plan, or what's known as the Auckland Unitary Plan, to really identify where those key risks and hazards are in a future climate scenario. So there were quite a lot of those things occurring, and overlaying that context of, well, what does this mean in our for the future of Auckland? How do we manage these future climate risks on infrastructure that is perhaps not fit for purpose for intense events? And the recent, Cyclone Vaianu was a stark reminder again of, for the want of about, 20, 30, 50 kilometres further east, we may have been suffering a further impact somewhere, if not across the whole region again. And we saw that play out to an extent down the east coast of New Zealand.
And just going back to the payouts, it must have been really actually very difficult for you to manage, because you're liaising with the community but also central government. What was the split between Auckland Council and central government for the payouts?
Yeah, so it was 50-50, so a 50-50 payout. So, central government or cabinet made a decision in May, and we'd been working together with the Cyclone Recovery Task Force that led by Sir Brian Roche. But it wasn't until Cabinet made that decision that we had some certainty about that they were proposing this categorisation system. And then the funding arrangements came later, and we had to go out to Aucklanders in terms of funding the other 50%, which was a package of $2.2 billion, with the Crown funding essentially slightly more than half of that, across roading, future flood resilience projects, and the buyout program, and what's known as Category 2P, or the property level intervention, which is again about a $40 million program of grants to allow homeowners to make their homes and properties more resilient. So that had to go out and be consulted with other Aucklanders, the other people of Auckland, if you like, because that's the council didn't have $1 billion that they could just fund without talking to the other people of Auckland. It was also working alongside insurance companies to go, okay, what's Insurance Retreat look like? How can we give you assurance around how we're managing these places in the future that are perhaps vulnerable from land instability, flooding, those future climate impacts? How do we ensure that people can get insurance and take care of often their most significant asset? Working with Treasury around that, negotiating the final funding agreement, and then implementing that. So having a framework that could assess homes from a flood perspective, from a landslip perspective. And we started that work before we had a final funding agreement in place. We obviously started it right back in February 2023, but we started the buyout process and getting people to register in July, August 2023, and then finally a final decision after feedback from Aucklanders around the funding. And Aucklanders generally were the submissions we received over 2,500 submissions into that process in a very a fast submission process for council. People were very supportive, but they told us a number of things that, there were a number of parties involved. Primarily, the government should be helping assist in the funding. Sure, council should be. Insurers need to fund it, and the homeowners who were impacted also needed to have some skin in the game, and that's where the settings came for those buyouts.
What were you expecting from the landowners?
Well, property owners had, they were impacted obviously, but also the settings of people who were insured. It would be a 95% contribution or 95% funding for the buyout against a 2023 market value. So what would the value of the home be? Would have been on the 26th of January 2023. But yeah, that 5% contribution, not insignificant for people, or if people were uninsured, a 20% contribution against that market value in 2023. So that was where the council landed. There was debate with Auckland Council about what that level of funding should be, but that's where they landed.
How did you work out the final amount that each homeowner received in their payout?
It was a market value assessed by a valuer for 2023. We just didn't use a capital value that was used in rating purposes. It was each property was valued, and then also a process of dispute against value that property owners could enter into, and valuers could come together and decide on that, agree or disagree on that value. So setting up dispute processes as well, not just around valuations, but around the categorisation. If people thought, no, we are a 3 or we're not a 3, we want to stay here. So those dispute processes we've dealt with over almost 600 disputes through this process, which are individual circumstances, not just around categorisation, but people's own individual special circumstances. The majority of them are people seeing themselves with individual special circumstances. So not just a straight property transaction, that's for sure.
I felt like the general feeling was that it was pretty fair and it was accepted mostly.
Yeah, that was the response that I see, is that yes, there were some tricky circumstances, but we worked through those with individuals, and I think having that a process of natural justice that allowed people to have input and put their case, and generally the valuations that occurred were seen as fair and reasonable. Muriwai, as a priority community, we focused on that area early on, along with others, and managed to get, I think, the first properties settlements or offers made by December 2023, which is quite a long time after the event, for sure. But in terms of how we've looked at that across and setting up the process, we looked at other regions in New Zealand and what they'd gone through in the past, significantly the Christchurch earthquakes, significantly some work that was done around Project Twin Streams, which was a stormwater project of buying out properties, but also looking at these sorts of situations in Australia, America and the UK, trying to look at what they had done and learn from those situations. And did we get it perfect? I'm sure people would say no, but certainly trying to understand, put ourselves in the shoes of those people who are impacted, and what would we expect if we were in that situation. So part of it was taking a customer experience approach, and that may not seem typical, but was actually putting ourselves in the shoes of those people who were impacted, and not only the homeowners but the communities as well. So that was quite a big focus for us to do that.
If there was another event, which no doubt there will be, unfortunately, do you feel like you have systems in place and you'll be able to respond maybe better next time?
Without a doubt. The circumstances will be different. The communities may be different. The government settings might be different. But we are in a much better place. We know and have captured, if you like, the artifacts of the events of 2023 to be much more ready to be able to respond. And part of that is an ongoing program with our community and social recovery team of working with communities. So we ran a program through that was delivered by Leadership New Zealand, where 28 community members put their hands up and said, we want to be more prepared in the future as well, and lead our community in these sorts of events. And they went through a leadership program. And then we've been working with 24 communities across the region who were impacted in 2023. But some of those areas that are also at potential risk that weren't impacted as badly or as significantly, so that it's the first time we talk to people about recovery or what the risks are of climate adaptation and what can occur at a property level, but also at a community level, is not the night of the event or a week when we're staring down the barrel of a cyclone heading towards us. So that's been an important part of what we've done. Capturing all that feedback from our navigation service. So we had stood up a navigation service to have, so people had a person to go to and understand where could they get help, what were their next steps, what was happening, what was the update. So each one of those navigators had a maximum of 31 clients, if you like, or 31 families to look after and make sure they were getting the right help. And not always, Auckland Council wasn't always providing that assistance, but pointing them towards government agencies or other community agencies where they could get assistance and help, including things like housing. So advocacy back into the government for temporary accommodation assistance when the insurance for alternative accommodation ran out. So all of those things have been captured. But there are some significant ingredients, if you like, of recovery, some significant kind of settings or conditions that we're capturing in a lessons learned approach at the end of this, and have been capturing those along the way, so that future people like me and our councillors, mayor and councillors, and our local board members and communities can be more prepared. Will they be totally prepared? No, but will we be more prepared for these events in the future? And that includes working with central government around a national climate adaptation plan. How is the government responding to climate adaptation? And Minister Watts, or this current coalition government minister of Simon Watts, has been leading that. And that was part of our funding agreement, or the council's funding agreement with the Crown, was central government needs to be more prepared as well and provide more certainty. Communities can't do this all on their own.
What was the initial communication? I know you worked quite closely with people like Mike Hibbett and Claire Bradley. What was the initial communication and connection, and what made that work really well? Like, what could you say for other communities for how to connect with council really early on, and what did Muriwai do well in that respect?
I mean, that leadership that stood up through Mike and Claire, and there was through the surf club leadership as well. Early on, I'd had an involvement as a trustee of building Muriwai Surf Club, so I had some connection with the community myself. So, but we put in place having a single point of contact through Scott De Silva, and then our geotechnical engineers were out on site every day. So we quickly identified, the need to have a rallying point between the council and the community. And Claire and Mike, took that leadership role and helped curate our response, and for us to hear how the community was feeling, and what their information needs were, what would provide certainty, and just that building that trust and openness and honesty about what we could do when we were likely to be able to respond, was really critical. And building that one-on-one with myself, but with others as well, with our elected members, and with the people on the ground. So there was always someone for them to talk to, and we would respond. And then and it sounds trivial in some ways, but a newsletter that was focused on Muriwai, so that we could provide updates about what was happening. We had, meetings at Muriwai where people could ask the difficult questions, where we fronted up with ministers, with local MPs, with councillors, with decision makers from a governance point of view, and met the community, and then met them one-on-one as well. So being available was really, really important. And then later on, more generally, through webinars of providing information.
Do you feel like it's good for a community to have a few spokespeople who are the main people and the sort of conduits to getting the information to people in the community, or are you open to individuals also approaching you?
It was both, but I think that community leadership was critical, and that's one of the reasons we, developed what we've called the Adapting Together program. I talked about with Leadership New Zealand running a program that gave some training, because the Mikes and the Claires, they've had some leadership experience and knew their community really well, but we're expecting a lot of people, a huge investment in taking some things on their shoulders that, when they're impacted by these events as well. So, but that was really extremely helpful when people emerged from within the community to be able to take a leadership role. Much more difficult to speak to the individuals in many, but retain an option for people to do that. I think they were great advocates for themselves, which is fantastic. They also came together strongly as a community. There was an obvious strong community presence that they'd had. Neighbours knew neighbours. They looked after each other. They advocated for themselves and each other. They advocated as a community and a single voice, which is a very powerful thing to do in a political environment. So they were able to get their message across extremely strongly. The community came together quite strongly, and they used the mechanisms they had. Personally, I was quite proud to see the surf club as a trustee before that was built. And as at that time I was general manager of Parks, Sport and Recreation, and previously director of Parks and Recreation in Auckland Regional Council, sort of getting that across the line. But having a community hub became really, really important. And since, seeing some more resilience put in place there, so dealing with that, it did flood on the night of Gabrielle, but that's where people went. And that was always the intention, that that would be a community place of gathering.
I've spoken to Nate and Kate. It's so nice to see, all the stuff that's been put in place since, I feel like the whole community is much more prepared. I don't know, just knows what to do. And even with the cyclone, was it last week, week before, all the communication that came out from the Muriwai Community Association, that kind of thing it's really good.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think we are way more prepared. And I imagine, do you feel like other communities are more prepared, or
Yeah.
does it take an event to really hit a community before they take action?
I guess my key point is that it is in a weather event or in an emergency event, it's a societal response. And that was one of the things I think there was an expectation there would be, an army of people that were ready and waiting, and that's not the case. That requires some activation for people to do that. And New Zealand Defence Force does that. Auckland Emergency Management, Auckland Council, the police, fire and emergency. All of that occurs, but I think the community actually responding is that whole societal approach is so important. But I do think communities are generally more prepared than they were last time. Those communities that were impacted will be stronger, and it's part of our job to make sure that communities not so much don't forget, but continue to take those good old-fashioned approaches of neighbourhood, knowing your neighbour, knowing your community, coming together as a community. And I think places like Muriwai were probably well served. Those small coastal communities are pretty tight, and they come together quickly in the case of adversity, but because they've come together in normal times as well as a community. In some places, that's been lost.
What are you doing, or what's the council doing to ensure that the land that was deemed unlivable continues to be seen like that into the future?
Yeah, so that's really critical, and it's from a personal perspective, it's something I promised myself that I would, make sure happened. So that is going to be, on each of the property files, but there's a future piece of work around storm affected land. We're calling it the future of storm affected land. And part of that could be sold for reuse for non-residential. In some cases, it could, not in the case of Muriwai, I don't think it's needed for other infrastructure. So Watercare's going to use some of that land for the water supply functions. There's some stormwater work about to start in Muriwai that will need some of that land. But yes, putting some overlays, hazard overlays into the district plan, and if you like, covenanting that land as being unsuitable for development and managed as high hazard land. That's one of the key work streams for Muriwai, but for other areas as well. So we don't repeat those mistakes of the past where land, after a few years, it's forgotten about and it gets redeveloped. So that's a really important part of I don't want to say legacy, but the legacy of the recovery office and what we're achieving. And I think the community's been really clear about that as well.
Can you tell us where the recovery office is now within Auckland Council, and what things have been set up for the future?
Yeah, we're about to close the office. We were at one stage almost 400 people involved, and now we're closing the office on the 30th of June. We're not stopping some things. That's kind of bittersweet for me as we see people go. We're right down to about 38 people now, and we'll close right out. The recovery office itself, we have built some new roles into Auckland Emergency Management for recovery to build capability and capacity to be ready for recovery. And there's the community and social recovery team I talked about will continue for at least another 18 months, if not longer term, to have that community level of community engagement that's required.
It's just a sad thing, isn't it, that we know there's just going to be more events like this.
Yeah, that's the tragedy. And working together with colleagues, particularly in Gisborne and the Hawke's Bay, Bay of Plenty, that's been important too, to learn as a group. And nationally, there's now a group of recovery managers who are working much more strongly together to actually be more prepared as a nation, and support regions that might suffer these sorts of events. So I think you've got to look at the positive. A lot of good things have come out of it, and people have responded extremely well. There is some tragedy involved, and the coroner's inquiry, we're expecting that to come out later in the year. And it was important to me, for example, to go along. I gave evidence, but then when the widows of Craig and Dave were giving evidence, and fire service in particular focus on Muriwai, whilst I gave evidence, but staying and listening to that was difficult, but important. I think it's an important process, a really difficult process, but the leadership and the strength that was shown by people was significant. So, got to acknowledge that. It's the tragedy that occurs.
And finally, Mace, is there something you'd like to say to the Muriwai community?
I guess a key thing for me to say to Muriwai is thank you. You held yourself with real poise. You advocated, as your right was to do, to get the attention that you needed to recover. And your recovery has been at all levels. The community has really recovered strongly. The environment will take time to recover, but it's well on its way to doing that and returning to being the vibrant, really beautiful place that Muriwai is. Thank you for your time, the leadership, your patience, and allowing us to come into your community and help where we could. And I hope we have provided some, the support that was needed for Muriwai to recover.
Precipice was commissioned and funded by Muriwai Community Association, supported by the Auckland Council Recovery Office. Artwork by Taylor Williams, soundtrack by local Muriwai band Tin People, written in response to Cyclone Gabrielle. Ngā mihi, thank you to the Muriwai community for their input and bravery and for sharing their stories. And thank you for listening.